The wind carried the scent of pine resin and cold soil through the hills of Whispering Pines, a remote stretch of countryside where the asphalt roads surrendered to gravel and the night sky glowed unpolluted and pure. Nestled between the trees, half hidden behind a wall of fir and stone, stood a cabin that looked as if it had grown straight out of the earth itself. It was built by hand, each log carved, sanded, and placed with purpose, the kind of home that bore its maker's fingerprints in every groove and knot. The man who built it, Elias Ward, was not from the kind of world that held meetings in air-conditioned boardrooms or sent letters stamped with legal insignias. He was a sculptor, a man who turned wood into life, who believed that a home was not just a place to live but a reflection of the soul that shaped it. The cabin was his sanctuary, his proof that art and nature could coexist without boundaries. For years it stood undisturbed, its cedar beams weathering beautifully under the rain and sun. The small town nearby, Clearwater Ridge, knew of Elias only through whispers. He was the quiet man who came down to the farmer's market every few months, selling carved animals and rustic furniture. Few knew that the land he lived on had been passed down through generations, its ownership older than the town's founding itself. But time has a way of eroding solitude. The town grew, and with growth came rules written by those who feared the wild edges of life. When the Clearwater Development Association rebranded itself as an HOA, they promised order, safety, and progress. Their glossy brochures showed freshly painted fences, paved cul-de-sacs, and smiling faces. What they didn't show were the letters, the fines, and the quiet erasure of independence. It began with a notice nailed to Elias' gate. The paper flapped in the morning wind, stamped with the HOA seal, a crest of mountain peaks, and a slogan that read, "Preserving Community Standards." It declared that his cabin, being of non-regulated construction, was in violation of Section 14B of the Clearwater Housing Code. The letter demanded immediate action to dismantle and remove all unauthorized structures. Elias read it once, then twice. The ink bled slightly from dew, but the message was unmistakable. They wanted his home gone. He didn't respond. For him, silence was not defiance, it was patience. But to the HOA, silence was an invitation to escalate. Over the following weeks, more letters arrived. Then came photographs taken from the treeline showing measurements, boundaries, and supposed code violations. They cited his unapproved septic setup, his non-standard roofing, and even the way his rain barrels caught runoff from the roof. Elias knew better than to argue with bureaucrats who never set foot on dirt. Instead, he began to document everything, every letter, every picture, every uninvited step across his boundary line. His calm demeanor masked a slow, deliberate anger, one that grew not from rage but from resolve. As summer deepened, the HOA's campaign became more aggressive. A contractor appeared one morning claiming he'd been hired to inspect for demolition readiness. Elias watched from the porch, arms crossed, as the man fumbled with his clipboard, clearly uncomfortable under the weight of silence and the unspoken warning in Elias' eyes. The contractor left without saying much, but the message was clear: the HOA wasn't bluffing. By the time autumn came, a certified letter arrived, signed personally by the HOA president herself, Marla Danvers. Her reputation in Clearwater was one of polished control. She was a woman who wore her wealth like armor and her authority like a weapon. Her words dripped with condescension disguised as professionalism. The letter gave Elias 30 days to comply or face mandatory enforcement measures. That night, as the wind howled through the pines, Elias walked the perimeter of his land. The moonlight caught the sharp edges of the logs, the grooves in the bark that still bore his carving knife's touch. He stopped near the base of the cabin where a narrow hatch sat flush with the earth, barely visible unless you knew where to look. He crouched and brushed away the pine needles, exposing the old iron lock. The hatch creaked open, revealing the faint scent of dust and aged timber. Inside, beneath the cabin, was a space no one but Elias knew existed. A cellar carved deep into the earth, lined with old crates, blueprints, and boxes sealed with wax. He stepped down the narrow ladder, the light from his lantern casting long shadows across the stone walls. On a workbench sat a folder, its edges worn, the label faded. He traced the embossed letters: Clearwater Ridge, founding deeds and transfer records. This cabin wasn't just a home, it was a vault. And within it lay the kind of proof that could unravel the HOA from its roots. Elias closed the folder gently and exhaled. They wanted a fight, they were about to get one. But it wouldn't be the kind fought with hammers or saws. It would be fought with truth, timing, and the secrets buried beneath their manicured lawns. Above him, the trees swayed like sentinels, whispering warnings to the wind. The night grew darker, but Elias' resolve burned brighter. The cabin wouldn't bow down. Not now, not ever. And as dawn crept over the hills, the first hint of war shimmered in the light. The morning after the final notice arrived, the world outside seemed unnervingly calm. The mist hung low across the valley, curling around the cabin like a living thing, as if the land itself was holding its breath. For most of Clearwater Ridge, it was just another day, the hum of mowers, the sound of sprinklers, the low murmur of people content in their small slice of order. But for Elias Ward, the air was heavy with the weight of what was coming. He moved with quiet precision, his every step deliberate. The cabin's interior was simple, no luxury, no clutter, just craftsmanship. The wood glowed with a warm amber hue where the morning light filtered through the windows. On the table, spread open like an old map of war, lay the documents he had uncovered the night before: original deeds, property transfers, and records dating back nearly a century. At the center of it all, one set of papers stood out, an original land grant from 1894 marked with the seal of the state. The signature was faint but readable, proving the property had been privately owned long before Clearwater Ridge had even existed as a community. And then there were the newer documents, the ones that shouldn't exist. Elias had discovered inconsistencies in the land transfer records, all leading to the same name, Marla Danvers. Over the past decade, the HOA president had systematically rewritten property boundaries under the guise of zoning adjustments, quietly absorbing parts of private land into HOA control. Small parcels here and there, a fence line shifted by a few feet. A reclassification of a drainage lot enough to avoid suspicion. But Elias' cabin sat directly over the one boundary she couldn't rewrite. His land wasn't part of Clearwater Ridge, it predated it, which meant her authority over it was non-existent. Yet she had filed claims and sent legal threats as if she owned the soil beneath his feet. It wasn't just corruption, it was theft disguised as policy. Outside, a truck engine growled up the dirt road. Elias watched from the window as a black SUV came to a stop at the end of his drive. The HOA seal shimmered on the door. Two men stepped out, contractors again, but these were different. Suits under work jackets, clipboards with legal tabs, enforcers in disguise. They stood there for a long time, staring at the cabin as if measuring its defiance. Elias didn't move. He wanted them to look. He wanted them to see the kind of man who didn't yield to signatures or stamps. After a few moments they turned around, snapping pictures before driving away. That night the cabin felt smaller, not from fear but from focus. The storm was gathering. Elias began to organize his evidence into a structure that made sense: dates, signatures, maps, photographs. Every line that led back to Marla Danvers was drawn in red pencil. Each discovery layered atop the next like a puzzle, revealing its final image. He worked by lantern light, his movements steady, rhythmic. Outside, the woods whispered and shifted. Somewhere far off, an owl called. The wilderness was alive, indifferent to the squabbles of humans, yet Elias could feel the land watching him, almost urging him onward. By the third night, the harassment began. A loud engine at midnight, tires crunching the gravel just outside his property, the flash of headlights against the cabin walls, then darkness. Once someone threw a stone at his porch railing hard enough to splinter the wood. He didn't chase them. He just listened. Every sound told him exactly what he needed to know. They were getting desperate. The HOA's polite veneer was cracking. A week later, a new notice appeared, this time pinned directly to his cabin door. It wasn't from the HOA but from a law firm representing them. Legal jargon filled the page, demanding immediate compliance or risk seizure of property through eminent domain proceedings. Elias smiled. Eminent domain, a word they didn't have the authority to use. They were bluffing, and now they'd left a paper trail of their own deceit. He added it to his growing file. Meanwhile, Marla Danvers was tightening her grip over the rest of Clearwater Ridge. At the HOA meetings, she spoke about rogue residents and code violators endangering the integrity of the neighborhood. Her loyal followers nodded, sipping their coffee, never questioning the fear she planted in them. But one man, an aging surveyor named Harold Bryn, did question. He had been the one to draw up the original lot lines decades ago. He knew something wasn't right. Late one evening, a small envelope appeared in Elias' mailbox. No return address, just a folded map and a note written in block letters. "You were right, follow the creek." Elias spread the map across the table, tracing the ink lines under the flickering lamplight. The creek cut through the forest just beyond his property, curving east toward the edge of the HOA's jurisdiction. There, marked faintly in pencil, was a boundary that didn't appear on any of Marla's revised maps. He followed it the next morning, the frost crunching under his boots. The creek was half frozen, its water whispering beneath a thin shell of ice. And there, buried under decades of dirt and moss, he found the first marker, an old brass survey pin stamped with the same seal as his deed. The true boundary line was nearly 30 feet beyond what the HOA claimed. That was the proof he needed. When he returned to the cabin, the sky was already dimming, streaked with crimson. Elias placed the marker on his desk beside the files, the metallic surface catching the fading light. In that glint of gold he saw everything: the years of manipulation, the lies, the quiet theft of people's homes. He wasn't just defending his cabin anymore. He was defending every voice the HOA had silenced. The first step of his plan was nearly complete. He would gather his evidence, expose the fraudulent land grabs, and deliver it directly to the state attorney. But not yet. Timing was everything. He needed them to show their hand, to push just a little further. That night a storm rolled in. Wind howled through the trees, rain slashed against the roof, and thunder shook the valley. In that chaos, headlights appeared once more at the end of his drive, this time not just a truck, 3 vehicles. Figures stepped out, their flashlights cutting through the downpour, moving toward the cabin with purpose. Elias stood by the window, calm, steady. The trap was already set. The night was about to turn. The storm tore through the valley like a wounded beast, shaking the forest down to its roots. Rain hammered the roof of the cabin in furious rhythm, and flashes of lightning painted the night in strobing bursts of silver and blue. Elias stood at the window, motionless, watching as 3 sets of headlights pierced the darkness below. They stopped just beyond his front gate, their beams slicing through the rain. Silhouettes emerged, shadows in slick raincoats, flashlights in hand, purposeful steps crunching against the gravel. They weren't inspectors this time. They weren't contractors. They were enforcers, sent to intimidate, to scare, to make him yield. Elias turned away from the window and walked to the old trunk near his desk. From within, he pulled a waterproof case and slipped his folders inside. Then he lifted a small black device, a trail camera receiver connected to the dozen hidden cameras he'd installed along the property weeks ago. He flicked it on. The small monitor lit up, showing every angle of his land: the gate, the creek line, the perimeter fence, and the path through the pines. The intruders didn't know they were already surrounded. Outside, the men moved like they had permission. They opened the gate, trampling through the mud, muttering to one another. One of them carried a crowbar, another held a flashlight shaped like a baton. They reached the porch and hesitated, rain dripping from their hats. One man pointed to the notice of violation sign nailed to the door as if it were justification for what they were about to do. A flash of lightning illuminated their faces, hard, cold, expressionless. Elias let them knock. The sound was drowned out by thunder. He didn't answer. Instead, he watched through the monitor as one of them pulled something from his pocket, a small envelope sealed in red wax, and slid it under the door. Then they turned, muttering curses, and trudged back to their vehicles. The engines revved, tires spun in the mud, and then the lights vanished down the road. When silence returned, Elias picked up the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, rain-stained but legible. It wasn't a warning this time, it was a declaration of intent. The HOA had filed for immediate reclamation of non-compliant property to take effect in 72 hours. If he didn't vacate by then, they would begin demolition by force of municipal order. The morning the storm had passed, leaving behind a washed-out sky and the glimmer of wet pine needles. 72 hours. Plan was already in motion. He began with the trail camera footage. Every frame of the trespassers' visit was cataloged, timestamped, and saved to multiple hard drives. He cross-referenced the license plates of the vehicles, and as he expected, one of them was registered to a contracting company owned by Marla Danvers's brother-in-law. Another was leased to Clearwater Ridge's legal firm. Evidence piece by piece. He made copies of everything, digital and physical, and placed them in separate envelopes marked A, B, and C. One set would go to the county registrar. Another would go to a journalist he knew from years ago, a man who once interviewed him about rural land rights. The third would stay hidden, locked beneath the cabin in the cellar vault. The day felt sharper now, the air thinner, every minute mattered. As the sun climbed higher, Elias took his truck down to the old surveyor's shed on the edge of town. The building was falling apart, its roof sagging, its windows fogged with dust. Inside, among yellowed maps and rusty tools, he found what he was looking for, a binder labeled Clearwater Expansion Plan 1992. He flipped through the pages, each one brittle and fatting, until he reached the signatures. There it was again, Marla Danvers, listed as project consultant. She had been shaping this land long before anyone realized it. Elias photographed every page and returned home before nightfall. That evening he could feel the change in the air, the hum of tension that precedes a confrontation. Somewhere across town, the HOA was preparing their official action. He imagined Marla sitting in her marble-floored office, rehearsing her lines, convinced she held the power. But power, Elias knew, was never about who shouted loudest. It was about who held the truth when the shouting stopped. He sat at his desk, the documents spread before him like a battlefield map. Each folder, each photo, each signature was a weapon. The land deeds, the survey markers, the video evidence of illegal trespass, the falsified boundary adjustments, the recorded calls from contractors who'd been coerced into compliance. Together they formed an arsenal stronger than any bulldozer. By midnight, he was ready. The next morning, Elias filed his evidence with the county clerk's office, quietly, discreetly, before the HOA's lawyers could act. He handed over the sealed envelope labeled A, his face calm, his tone steady. The clerk, oblivious to the storm brewing behind the paperwork, stamped it with the official seal and placed it in the queue for review. The clock was ticking. When he returned home, a convoy of vehicles was waiting, 2 black SUVs, a county truck, and Marla Danvers herself. She stood at the front, her polished heels sinking slightly into the wet dirt, a hard smile fixed beneath her wide-brimmed hat. Her entourage surrounded her, clipboards ready as if they were there to witness history. Elias didn't step outside. He didn't need to. From his window he watched her point toward the cabin, gesturing sharply. The contractors nodded. A man in uniform, likely a deputy sympathetic to the HOA, walked up the porch and taped a red sign to the door. Demolition scheduled, 48 hours. Elias' jaw tightened, but his heart remained steady. He'd seen this kind of arrogance before in cities and corporations, and people who believed rules were tools to break the weak. But they had miscalculated. They didn't realize that by escalating so quickly they'd triggered a legal review, the very one he'd set in motion at dawn. All he had to do was wait. That night, Elias prepared for the final act. He uploaded the footage from his cameras to a cloud server, sending copies to multiple recipients with a simple message: if anything happens to me or my property, release everything. He then opened his cellar hatch one last time. The faint scent of cedar and earth filled the air as he descended into the quiet dark. He placed one final box on the table, a collection of letters from residents who had been fined, threatened, or harassed by the HOA. Stories like his, smaller in scale but born from the same injustice. He'd spent weeks collecting them, listening to their pain. When he sealed the box, he knew it represented more than evidence. It was a voice for everyone who had been silenced. Above ground, the night was calm again, deceptively calm. The trees whispered under the moonlight as if aware of the reckoning that was coming. Elias stood on his porch, looking out over the land that had defined his life. The cabin loomed behind him, solid, unbroken, proud. Tomorrow the HOA would return to destroy it, but tomorrow the truth would also rise. He whispered a silent vow to the pines, to the soil, to the generations before him. This was not surrender, this was the calm before justice. The dawn that followed was gray and heavy, the kind of morning that felt like the air itself was holding its breath. The forest stood still, drenched in mist, the trees bowed low under the weight of the night's rain. In the distance the faint growl of engines echoed, a sound that grew louder, closer, more deliberate. Elias Ward stood on his porch, his boots planted firmly on the damp wooden boards, a mug of black coffee cooling in his hand. The cabin behind him was silent, its windows reflecting the pale light of morning. Inside, everything was ready, every camera recording, every document duplicated, every piece of truth locked in place like the final stone in a fortress. The convoy arrived exactly as expected. 2 black SUVs, a white county utility truck, and a pair of marked vehicles bearing the seal of the Clearwater Development Authority. From the lead car stepped Marla Danvers. Even in the mud and chill, she looked immaculate, her coat tailored, her shoes spotless, her expression sharp enough to cut through stone. Behind her came a team of contractors and 2 deputies. They spoke in low voices, glancing up at the cabin like men about to dismantle something sacred. One deputy carried a folder, the official demolition order, signed, dated, and Elias knew completely fraudulent. He didn't move as they approached. From her place at the front, Marla surveyed the cabin with the cold pride of someone who believed she had already won. The rain had darkened the logs, the chimney still trailed a thin thread of smoke, and the cabin looked both ancient and unbreakable. Marla's voice carried over the wind. Elias couldn't hear the words, but he knew their tone: command, arrogance, finality. The contractors began unloading equipment: chainsaws, hammers, crowbars. One man revved the engine of a bulldozer parked at the edge of the clearing. The sound roared through the trees, startling a flock of crows into the sky. Elias watched in silence, his eyes calm, his pulse steady. They were walking into their own undoing, because at that very moment, across the county, his evidence had reached the right hands. The clerk's office had received the flagged documents early that morning, triggering an automatic alert to the state's property registry. Within minutes, inconsistencies in the Clearwater Ridge development records were detected: unauthorized alterations, false plats, missing signatures. What Marla thought was hidden under years of bureaucracy had been ripped open in daylight, and in the age of digital records, exposure was swift. By the time the bulldozer's engine roared to life, Elias' story had already begun to move through the wires of the town: emails, phone calls, whispers. The county registrar, the state auditor, even a local journalist had received the files. What had started as one man's defense was now a wildfire of evidence, but Marla didn't know that yet. She barked orders to the men, her heels sinking slightly in the mud, and they began moving toward the porch. Elias stepped down to meet them halfway, his posture still unflinching. The rain had turned to a fine mist, coating everything in a ghostly sheen. Marla's mouth moved, words meant to intimidate, to humiliate, but Elias didn't respond. He simply reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. He held it out calmly. The nearest deputy took it and read the heading aloud under his breath. His eyes widened. It was a certified notice from the state registrar's office: immediate hold on all Clearwater HOA actions pending investigation of land fraud. Marla froze. The deputy's gaze flicked between her and Elias, confusion creeping into his voice. The bulldozer's engine died as the operator hesitated. Silence descended on the clearing like a wave. Elias spoke only once, his tone low, measured, final. Though his words were lost beneath the rain, the message was unmistakable. This was over. Marla reached for the paper, her hand trembling slightly, but Elias had already turned away. Behind him the cabin stood unshaken, the smoke from its chimney curling like a quiet victory banner. Then came the sound, a sharp crunch of tires against gravel. Another vehicle approached, smaller, official. The county assessor stepped out, flanked by a man in a gray suit carrying a badge, the investigator from the state. Marla's face drained of color. Within minutes the confrontation shifted. The investigator began asking questions, real ones, about permits, about deeds, about why an HOA had attempted to seize a private property outside its jurisdiction. Marla stammered, reaching for words that used to work, terms like compliance, neighborhood integrity, regulations. But every word she spoke only dug the hole deeper. The investigator stood in the background, silent, letting truth do the talking. His expression hardened. The contractors were told to stand down, the deputies stepped back, and then with a calm that felt heavier than thunder, the investigator turned to Marla and informed her that her actions and the HOA's conduct were now part of an active state investigation. The clearing was silent except for the sound of the rain. Marla tried to regain control. She raised her voice, accusing Elias of falsifying evidence, of staging the entire thing. But when she looked up, she saw the trail cameras mounted on the trees, each one blinking red, each one having recorded every second of their unlawful attempt. The truth was undeniable. Elias walked back up to the porch and rested his hand on the wooden railing. The contractors began packing their tools. The bulldozer was turned off. The vehicles reversed one by one, the sound of retreat echoing through the valley. Marla lingered last, staring up at the cabin that had defied her, the man who had beaten her and the land that refused to yield. When she finally turned away, her pristine shoes were caked with mud. The investigator remained for a while, collecting statements, taking copies of documents, snapping photographs. Before he left, he looked at Elias and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the man who had stood alone against a machine built on arrogance and greed. When the last engine faded into the distance, Elias was left with only the whisper of the wind through the pines. The forest felt alive again, the kind of alive that comes when balance is restored. He went inside, set his mug on the table and exhaled deeply. His hands trembled not from fear but from the slow release of months of tension. He looked around the cabin at the walls he had built, the beams he had carved, the floor that still smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. It had survived. But something inside him knew this wasn't finished. Justice had been set in motion, yes, but the people behind the HOA, the investors, the ones who had turned greed into a system, would not go quietly. They had lost the first battle, but they would regroup. They always did. Elias poured himself another cup of coffee and stood at the window. The mist had begun to lift, revealing the ridges of the valley in soft light. Birds returned to the trees. The world was waking up again. Tomorrow, the headlines would tell a story of corruption exposed and justice served, but the real story was simpler. It was about a man who refused to bow down, a cabin that stood like truth against deceit, and the unshakable spirit of the land that birthed them both. And as Elias looked out over the forest, a quiet determination stirred in him once more. The fight was no longer just about his home. It was about protecting every inch of land, every voice, every life that the powerful thought they could control. The storm had broken, but the war for the countryside had only begun. The morning after the confrontation at Whispering Pines, the town of Clearwater Ridge woke to an uneasy stillness. The storm had passed, but what it left behind wasn't just broken branches and flooded ditches. It was a rupture in the illusion of order. For years, the HOA had been a quiet empire. Its rules, its fees, its letters, small instruments of control disguised as community care. No one questioned it, not really. People just complied, believing peace was worth submission. But now whispers rippled through the town like wind across a wheat field. They spoke of what had happened at Elias Ward's cabin, how the state investigator had arrived just in time, how Marla Danvers had been caught in the act of overreach, how the man they'd once called a recluse had stood his ground while the mighty HOA fell silent in front of him. By midday, every coffee shop, hardware store, and diner in Clearwater hummed with speculation. Some residents were angry, shocked that their trust had been so easily abused. Others were afraid, realizing their property lines too might have been manipulated. And others still were quietly proud, their voices low but firm when they said, "He did what none of us could." Elias didn't go into town. He didn't need to. He could feel the change in the air even from his porch. It was the sound of fear shifting into courage, one neighbor at a time. Inside his cabin, he kept to his routine. The smell of sawdust and coffee still defined his mornings, but the silence that had once been peaceful now carried a strange tension, a sense of waiting. Then came the first call. The journalist he had sent his evidence to, Daniel Cross, had published the story that morning. The Hidden Empire: How a Rural HOA Stole the Countryside. The headline was bold, the story even bolder. It detailed everything: the fraudulent boundary shifts, the illegal property seizures, the misuse of county enforcement, and the intimidation of residents. The photos of Elias' cabin framed against the misty pines became the symbol of resistance. Within hours, the article spread beyond Clearwater Ridge. Regional news picked it up, then national outlets. The story of a humble craftsman standing up to a corrupt homeowners association struck a chord across the country. In a world where people were tired of being told what to do with their own lives and land, Elias became an accidental hero. His inbox filled with messages. Some offered help, others shared their own stories, tales of HOAs gone too far, of ordinary people bullied into submission. And for the first time, Elias realized this wasn't just about his cabin. It was about a system built on arrogance and greed. The next few days were chaos for the HOA. The state froze all its operations pending investigation. Bank accounts were audited, meetings were canceled, contractors pulled out of their deals, and Marla Danvers, once the untouchable queen of Clearwater, found herself cornered by the very rules she had twisted for years. When the investigators searched her office, they found falsified documents, backdated forms, and payment records linking her to developers who'd been quietly buying up land around the town. She had planned to transform Clearwater Ridge into a luxury estate, a controlled paradise for the rich, built on stolen soil. The dream had turned to rot. Elias watched it all unfold from afar, not with glee but with the sober calm of a man who had seen too much to celebrate destruction. Justice wasn't triumph, it was restoration, and restoration took time. Still, there was one thing he couldn't shake: the feeling that Marla wasn't finished. People like her never went down quietly. 2 nights later, as twilight deepened into blue, he found his suspicion confirmed. Footsteps crunched on the gravel outside. Elias turned down the lantern and listened. The sound was soft but deliberate, someone approaching, not sneaking but not friendly either. A figure emerged from the mist, Marla Danvers herself. Her once impeccable clothes soaked from the drizzle, her expression raw and desperate. She didn't knock. She stood in the clearing, staring at the cabin, the faint glow of the hearth reflecting in her eyes. There was no entourage this time, no guards, no confidence, only fury and fear. Elias didn't go out to meet her. He stayed by the window, watching as she paced the edge of his property, muttering to herself. She pulled a folded paper from her coat, stared at it, then tore it to pieces, scattering them like ashes. Whatever power she'd held was gone. She was just another person now, standing in the rain, facing the truth she'd tried to bury. After a few minutes she turned and walked away, swallowed by the mist. Elias didn't feel pity, but he did feel closure. The following morning the headlines hit harder. Clearwater HOA president resigns amid criminal investigation. Marla was out. The board was dissolved. The town council announced a full restructuring of property management under state oversight. The HOA's iron grip had been broken. Elias' cabin was safe, legally recognized, officially exempt from any association governance. But more importantly, it had become a symbol. People came by not to gawk but to thank him. Old farmers, young families, even a few city transplants who'd once trusted the HOA. They brought gifts, bread, coffee, tools. They offered to help repair the porch that the contractors had damaged. Elias accepted their kindness with quiet gratitude. For the first time in years, he felt part of the community again, not as the reclusive artist, but as the man who had reminded them of something essential: freedom. Weeks passed. The air grew colder. The valley shifted into the slow rhythm of late autumn. One afternoon, as Elias worked on a new sculpture by the window, the mail truck rumbled up the drive. The postman handed him a thick envelope marked with the state seal. Inside was an official letter. All claims against your property have been dismissed. The state recognizes your ownership in perpetuity under original deed protection. Additionally, your testimony and documentation have led to the recovery of 27 improperly seized lots within Clearwater Ridge. The land will be returned to its rightful owners. Elias read the letter twice. Then, for the first time in months, he allowed himself a smile. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees and the cabin creaked softly as if it too was exhaling. But as he set the letter down, his eyes drifted toward the distant ridge beyond the creek, where survey flags still fluttered faintly in the breeze. The land was free for now, but the hunger for control never truly died. It only waited for its next vessel. He knew more would come: developers, investors. Maybe another HOA with a different name. But next time Clearwater Ridge would not be so easily fooled. Elias had made sure of that. He had given them not just a story but a warning, one carved into the heart of the hills, whispered through the pines, and written into the wood of a cabin that refused to bow down. And as the evening light faded and the valley turned gold, the old craftsman returned to his workbench, his hands steady, his purpose renewed. The battle had ended. But the watch had only just begun. Winter came early that year. The first frost glazed the valley in silver, and the pines around Clearwater Ridge stood tall and silent beneath a pale, watchful sky. The town had changed since the storm of the HOA's collapse, though not all at once. Real change, the kind that takes root, moves slowly like thawing ground beneath ice. Elias Ward's cabin remained the quiet heart of that transformation. It was no longer just a dwelling on the edge of the woods. It was a landmark, a story carved into the land itself. Travelers stopped to take photos at the end of the gravel road, not daring to walk too close but reverent of what it symbolized: defiance in the face of corruption and the enduring power of truth. Inside, life had returned to something resembling normal. Elias spent his mornings sketching, his afternoons carving, and his evenings by the fire. The chaos had burned itself out, leaving behind a stillness that felt earned. Yet even in the calm, echoes of the past remained. Letters continued to arrive from strangers across the country: farmers, ranchers, small-town families, all with their own battles against overreaching HOAs, predatory developers, and bureaucracies that had forgot humanity. Many wrote not just to thank him but to ask for guidance. How had he done it? How had he stood alone and still prevailed? Elias never wrote long replies. He didn't see himself as a teacher or a hero, but he told them the truth: know your land, know your rights, and when they come for what's yours, don't let them take it quietly. That was all. Still, his quiet defiance became a movement. Online, people began referring to their struggles as cabin cases, a term inspired by the story that had spread far beyond Clearwater Ridge. Communities began forming their own cooperatives, rejecting restrictive associations and forming councils of neighbors instead. Freedom, once a forgotten word in the countryside, had become fashionable again. For Elias, the recognition meant little. Fame was just another form of noise. What mattered was that the valley, the land itself, was finally breathing freely. But peace rarely lasts untested. One crisp morning, a convoy of unfamiliar trucks appeared at the edge of town. They bore the emblem of a large development firm from the city, Eastridge Holdings. Their plan, as word spread, was to purchase several acres of old farmland north of Elias' property to build what they called a modern eco-living retreat. The phrase alone set the townsfolk on edge. It sounded harmless: green energy, sustainable housing, clean design. But Clearwater Ridge had learned to look beneath pretty language. Eco-living was just another mask for control, and sustainability often meant profit dressed in virtue. The town gathered at the community hall that evening. Old faces filled the benches: farmers with calloused hands, young families, retirees, and the few remaining artisans. The mood was tense but determined. They wouldn't let another empire take root. When Elias arrived, the crowd fell quiet. He wasn't there to lead but to listen. Still, when his name was called, He stood and faced them all, his neighbors, his friends, the people he had once watched from a distance. He spoke plainly, his voice steady. He reminded them of what had been lost when they trusted authority without question, of how easily ownership could be stolen when wrapped in legal jargon. He told them the truth about the cabin's battle, not the headlines, but the nights of fear, the weight of standing alone. And then he told them something more. This time you're not alone. The room stirred with energy. Plans began forming, petitions, legal reviews, surveys. The same county officials who once turned a blind eye now tread carefully under the scrutiny of a newly awakened town. Within weeks the developers withdrew their offer. The land would remain untouched. Clearwater Ridge had drawn its line again. That night Elias returned to his cabin, the stars glimmering cold above the treetops. He lit a small fire and sat by the window, watching the embers pulse like distant beacons. The cabin creaked softly as if alive, whispering to him through its beams and timbers. He realized then that this place, this hand-built home, had become more than shelter. It had become a voice. A silent witness to truth older than any law or deed, that the land remembers who cares for it. Weeks turned to months. The snow melted and spring began to touch the valley again. Flowers pushed through thawing soil and the river, once swollen and angry, ran clear. The town slowly found its rhythm, free and unafraid. One morning Elias walked out to the edge of his property where the old boundary posts stood. The sun caught the wood, still carved with the initials he'd burned there years ago. EW, they were faded but unbroken. He placed a new post beside them, not as a warning but as a symbol. A marker for those who came after. On it he carved a single phrase: stand your ground but let the truth grow. Then he stepped back, smiled faintly, and let the forest wind carry his words away. By the time summer arrived, the story of the cabin had become folklore. Locals told it to travelers passing through, about the artist who refused to bow down, the cabin that outlasted corruption, and the town that learned to fight back. Some said Elias still lived there, carving his stories into wood. Others whispered he'd moved deeper into the mountains, building again, somewhere far from the reach of any council or contract. No one knew for sure. But the cabin remained, its windows glowing softly at dusk, smoke curling from the chimney, and the sound of tools echoing faintly through the trees. And if you stood close enough on a quiet evening you might swear you heard it, the steady rhythm of a chisel, carving not just art but legacy. A reminder that even in the quietest corners of the world justice can take root, and that no power, no council, no corrupt empire can stand forever against a man who builds with truth in his hands.